Thanks, everyone. If at any point you can't hear me very well, just wave your hands at me and I'll come closer to the mic. I know it's a little loud. But hey, AppSec Village, welcome to my talk, One Low to Informational, Why Your Pentest Findings Are So Boring. I'm Robyn Lundin. I'm currently a product security engineer at Slack. Before that, I was a penetration tester for NCC Group. And then I also spent a brief stint as a Django developer for a very small startup that actually no longer exists, but they had really good ideas, and startups are hard. So I know we're at DEF CON, but I figured I would introduce the process of penetration testing for anyone that's uninitiated. Today we're going to be talking mostly about penetration test planning from an AppSec perspective. And the TLDR of it is that a company will hire hackers to test their application for security issues. Today we're primarily going to be focusing on hiring external consultants rather than doing internal pen tests. And we're also going to be focusing on just application pen tests, not network pen tests, not red teams. So sorry if you're a red teamer out there, this one's not about you today. While some companies hire penetration testers with a genuine curiosity about their application's attack surface, others might just need to stay compliant with an alphabet soup of compliance frameworks, and with that, they might not take that process very seriously. But either way, penetration tests are pretty darn expensive, so even if you're just trying to stay compliant, it's worth your time to try to get some value out of it. And the value of a well-done penetration test is to find and fix vulnerabilities before the baddies can exploit them. But a poorly done penetration test can be worse than no pen test at all, because it's going to provide you with this false sense of assurance in the security of your application. So why am I up here? Now, because I've spent some time as a developer, a penetration tester, and on a product security team, I've got a bit of a unique perspective when it comes to pen tests that allows me to empathize a little bit with most of the different parties that will be involved in a standard web app pen test. The intended audience today is going to be AppSec teams, but hopefully everyone in the audience is going to learn something, and I hope all you pen testers out there feel seen. So yes, penetration tests are very expensive. And when I say expensive, we're talking in the tens of thousands and sometimes even in the hundreds of thousands, depending on how big your application is and how much of it you want covered. So when we make mistakes in our pen test planning, they can be extremely costly in time and money. And let's talk a little bit about the title of this talk. One low, two informational. What exactly does that mean? So frequently, penetration tests will yield very few and very low impact, kind of meaningless findings. And if your pen test report only has one low risk finding and two informational findings, your team might think they're doing a really great job at securing their application. Like, yeah, we won the game, we're ready to ship it. There are no security bugs in this app. Now, that might not necessarily be the case. You might just be a shitty planner. So before we jump into talking about common mistakes you make during penetration test planning, though, I'd like to take a quick detour. Let's talk about event planning. Now, let's say you're trying to plan a super fancy event. It's going to be a black tie gala where every guest is paying 10 grand for a ticket. And you decide you're going to hire a wait staff to create a fancy environment for your fancy event. You're expecting that your servers are going to be able to describe in detail what foie gras tastes like, what wine pairs best with a filet mignon with classic French Bordelaise sauce, what forks go with your oyster platter. Is anyone hungry? So, you start looking for the servers to staff your event, and you find a few people who work at a diner down the street. That diner serves exclusively dishes that are made out of Spam. And these servers will work for super cheap, and they seem nice enough. So you're saving a ton of money. And then the nice lady on the slide promises that the servers are going to deliver exactly the results that you expect. And they're going to meet your expectations. Now, there's nothing wrong with this diner. If you want Spam and eggs, they've got your back. But it's probably a stretch to think that the servers that work there understand fine dining. Okay, so the scenario I've outlined on this slide is obviously a recipe for disaster. You got 700 guests, 3 servers, you're serving a 10-course meal with wine pairings, And your expectation is that this is going to get done within 15 minutes. Our expectations here are physically impossible. And worse yet, the company that contracted you, the servers, they might not understand in advance that this just isn't going to work. I hope you guys like Monty Python. Otherwise, you're really going to just like the rest of these slides, but here we are. Let's talk about what's going on here. We haven't told the staff that we hired to serve our event any details about what their job is. We haven't told them what they're supposed to serve the guests or what they should wear. Actually, we haven't even told them who our guests are. We haven't then told them about the boundaries of our event. And we also sold a bunch of VIP tickets. And we told our extra important guests that they were going to get special attention from our servers. So now what happens is your servers show up, they're wearing silly French-made costumes, and they are serving albatross because you didn't tell them you wanted fancy food. And they go outside of your event, they go to the hotel next door, and they start serving people that aren't even guests of your venue. Your VIP guests are going to go hungry. By now we know that we are really, really bad at party planning. We didn't make any food. We didn't give the servers any serving trays. We didn't buy booze. We didn't hire entertainment. So now we're serving our VIP guests glasses of water and charging them $10,000 a ticket. Actually, we completely forgot that we were hosting an event altogether. Oopsie. We didn't let the servers or the caterers into our venue. We completely locked them out. We didn't even tell the event staff where the party was. And they tried calling us. They tried calling us 17 times, but we didn't pick up the phone. Now, of course, because we've proven ourselves to be total garbage at party planning, we didn't think through cleanup. We left behind an absolute disaster, and we just assumed someone's going to clean this mess up eventually, right? We figured that hiring a cleaning crew was probably going to be really expensive, so we didn't bother. But now, we're probably going to get a massive bill from the event venue for cleanup that costs more than it would have cost for us to hire a cleaning crew in the first place. I'm going to take a sip of water while we think about what we've done. So what mistakes did we make today during our party planning, and how does it relate to a penetration test? And if you've ever run or conducted a penetration test, you might have an idea of where I'm going with this. So what was our first mistake? We hired the wrong people. In our event planning scenario, we had a set of expectations that involved servers who are well-versed in fine dining, and then we proceeded to hire servers that work in a diner with somewhat questionable food. Companies will often do something similar when hiring Pentest consultants. For example, they'll hire consultants without asking their area of expertise. And if you hire a company that does Nessus scans to complete a manual application pen test with a code review, your results are probably not going to be what you expect. You might choose a vendor solely based on money. You could choose a consultancy before having any idea of what you want to get out of the process. Or you might pick a consultancy just based on name recognition without really doing a whole lot of research. Companies might make this mistake due to a lack of understanding of the pen test process, or it could just be for saving time and money. Now, just because you've heard of a consultancy does not mean that they do the kind of work that you need. And just because a consultancy is cheap and guarantees that they are going to finish your pen test within, say, 3 days, doesn't mean you're actually saving time and money. Now, saving time and money is great, but the savings that you get up front may cost you time and money in bug bounty payouts, security incidents, and undiscovered bugs that are left in the wild. Your biggest cost might not even be apparent to you until you're on the front page of Hacker News and all of your customers are fleeing. So what's our fix? We hire the right people. That sounds obvious, but it's not always easy. So assuming that you need to hire someone external for compliance reasons or other reasons, let's talk about what you should consider when hiring an external consultancy to complete a pen test. It's easy to assume that because the consultancy is well done, that they're going to do a good job in your specific application. but it can be a dangerous assumption to make. The large companies have a wide variety of consultants with many different specialties, so they might have exactly what you need. But small boutique firms are also worth your time, because they often specialize in one specific area of expertise. So maybe they're really great at mobile security, maybe they're really great at cloud security, or in Slack's case, we recently hired a consultancy that was really, really great at Electron apps, and that worked out well for us. Before you have your initial call with the salespeople and the consultants at that company, make sure that you're very clear on what you're testing and what results that you expect from the test. So keep track of what language and framework you're using, about how many APIs you want to be covered, what kinds of bugs do you care about, what kinds of bugs are you less concerned about, and what's your preferred methodology? So you might want a black box test where you don't provide the testers with any code, but you do provide them with, the target that they're supposed to be looking at. You might want a gray box test where you do give the code and you give the environment that you would like them to target, but you're not expecting full code review. Or you might want a white box test where you get some manual testing and also full code review. Or at the end of the day, maybe you do just want an ESSA scan, and that's fine too. Apart from your technical considerations, it's also important to get a read on the company's level of professionalism. How did the consultants come across during your scoping calls? Are they patient and are they curious? Or have they been kind of rude and cocky and judgmental? You probably don't want your dev team crying during your readouts. And you can also ask for sample reports from these companies that you're hiring. They can be very informative. Pay attention to the wording in their sample reports and see if there's detailed remediation guidance. Do you understand that remediation guidance? Is their phrasing professional, or is it maybe confrontational and a little bit hostile? Unprofessional reports can cause a lot of friction between AppSec teams and dev teams, and we don't like that. Okay, so what was our second mistake that we made during party planning? We had some unrealistic expectations. We know that there's absolutely no way that 3 people are going to serve a 10-course meal to 700 people in 15 minutes. So why do we keep making pen testers cover huge attack surfaces within unreasonable timeframes? Let's say we've got 700 API endpoints, we've got 3 consultants, we want full manual testing for the OWASP top 10 on all of those endpoints within a week. I don't think that's reasonable, and I don't think that's going to happen. But show of hands, who here that maybe has pen tested or done security assessments in the past has been asked to do a security assessment of a massive monolithic application within a week? That's what I thought. Now, when I was a pen tester, I even had companies try to hire me to do a manual test of a new feature within 3 days. Now, let's think about what those 3 days look like. Day 1, I'm onboarding, and I'm getting my equipment ready, and having a kickoff call. Day 2, I'm reading documentation, I'm using the feature, and hopefully getting some testing in. And then day 3, I'm writing my report and having a readout call. Now, all of that's assuming that I've actually gotten access to the application on day 1, which is somewhat unlikely in my experience. So if your goal is to have assurance in your security posture and receive a report with meaningful findings, then giving this massive scope and a teeny tiny time frame is probably a pretty bad approach. Although if your goal is to check the boxes that you said you had a pen test without actually improving your security posture, this might work fine for you, but that's not what this talk is about. What's our fix? We need to prioritize, and we might need a little bit of a reality check. There are a number of factors that you need to consider when making decisions about the length of your pen test engagement. You might have a shoestring budget. You might have this looming deadline to get this pen test done before you launch your product next month. Although if your launch is next month, maybe you should have been thinking about the pen test like 6 months ago. Your app might be extremely complex, and you might have hundreds of different possible roles that your users could be, using. And you should always assume that the consultants are going to experience access issues and technical difficulties, and that they're going to need to spend time reading your docs. Your app actually might not be as easy to use as you think it is. So leave time for learning. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. Now, in a perfect world, the number one factor in determining the number of days that you're going to include in the scope of work for your pen test would be achieving as much coverage as possible on as much of the attack surface as possible. But in reality, our number one factor is probably going to be money. We all have budgets. So if you're on a budget, it's going to be even more crucial to outline your priorities to your testers. Now, speaking of priorities, let's talk about scoping. You remember in our event planning scenario, we didn't give our servers enough information to know who our VIP guests were or what to serve them, or really like what to wear, where to go, all of that. So same thing with penetration tests. You have to tell the testers what you think is the threat to your customers and ask them, what to target, and tell them what to target. So if you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, yes, you'll know that up on the screen, those knights are running away from a killer rabbit. Do you know where your killer rabbits are in your application? And are you going to tell your testers about all your killer rabbits? I've worked on pen tests in the past where the kickoff call, during that kickoff call, the hosting company gave me one set of credentials and a URL, and that was my target. Sometimes those are really fun engagements for me, because I got to just poke around at whatever I thought was interesting, and there was usually a lot to find. But that probably was not the most productive use of time for the company that hired me. It's entirely possible I left a very large attack surface uncovered because I didn't know it was there, or I didn't realize it was important. So if you don't know your own application well enough to be able to provide a detailed pen test scope, including what you do and don't care about to your testers, how do you expect them to find anything, or deliver anything worthwhile? So what's our fix? We need a tight, detailed, and thoughtful scope. You want to think about the high-risk areas of your application. And your high-risk areas are probably always going to include things like authentication, authorization, session management, any customer-facing security controls, and any features that are intended exclusively for use by higher privileged users, because you want to make sure that if you've got an admin portal, only the admins can get in there. Your known problem areas are probably going to become more apparent in more mature companies. So at Slack, we've started to use past bug bounty findings, security tickets from our bug tracking system, and topics of past incidents to help us inform our scope. We also like to keep track of features that we release that we believe have the highest potential to maybe pose a security risk to our customers, and we'll include those features within our scope of our annual pen test. If you have an application with a very large attack surface, it might help to break your pen test down into smaller components, and at Slack we'll include different components and features in each pen test, and then let the testers know how we'd like to prioritize those features. So higher risk features will usually go higher on the priority list, and lower risk features wind up lower on the priority list, so that we make sure they're spending their time testing the things that we care about. You also probably will want to spend some time threat modeling with your eng teams. That can be a part of your scope as well. Now, if you've never threat modeled, it's time to learn. You might want to research different threat modeling frameworks like Stride, or you can come up with different threat actors that might benefit from attacking your customers. And just put on your evil hat and think about, what would the bad guys do? Threat modeling can be an incredibly valuable exercise, and you don't necessarily need a huge amount of technical expertise or security knowledge to be really good at it. Some of the most productive threat modeling sessions I've had are with product managers or with engineers that really haven't spent any time in security. They have a totally different perspective than I do, and they think about things that I don't. So you just have to understand that the value of your product, who your customers are, and how would a criminal attacker benefit from attacking your customers? What do they want? Spoiler alert, usually what they want is money. So how could a criminal make money by attacking your specific customers? You'll want to include those threat scenarios in your scope. Now, don't try to hide your skeletons. I've seen people do this before. You want to bring the consultants to the closet where you keep the skeletons. Open that door and just tell them, hey, these are the skeletons. We know these are here. We'd love to know where the rest of the skeletons are in the building. Help us find more of these. Your scope also should include information on things that you don't care that much about. So for example, if you run a social media app, you probably care a lot about cross-site scripting because your MO is to take user-generated content and reflect it back to other users. But you might not care as much about user enumeration because you want your users to be able to find each other. If they can already find each other, then user enumeration bugs might be kind of lower on your priority list. You want your pen testers to focus on the things that your company cares about. And then think about these risky areas of your app as your VIP guests. All right, back to our terrible event. If you recall, we didn't make food, we didn't hire entertainment, and we didn't buy any drinks to serve our guests. When we're pen test planning, companies might decide to hire testers without giving them documentation or text accounts or code access. We might even have a half-baked product that is nowhere near ready for GA. For some of the pen tests I've been on, the company seems to want to see what the testers could find without any assistance from the team. 100% black box environment with the expectation that I'm going to find a way in within like 30 seconds, just like in the movies. But this strategy is pretty highly flawed. This is kind of more what bug bounty programs are for. These bug bounty researchers are used to black box environments where they don't really get any help finding bugs, and they just kind of poke around at their own leisure. Now, remember, attackers who are after your customers often have unlimited time and ample resources, depending on who hired them. They might have been hired by like an adversarial government that has massive, massive amounts of money and just tells them, hey, go nuts, take as long as you need. So your pen testers are already at a disadvantage. They have very limited time and very limited resources. Now you can level the playing field a bit by doing as much setup and planning as you can before your pen test engagement. And sometimes companies will ask testers to create their own test accounts. And sometimes that's possible if you have self-serve account creation in your application, but it's really time-consuming. So it's kind of a time waster when your testers only have 2 weeks and you're asking them to set up their own environment. And then as far as code access goes, I know some companies think that the consultant's going to steal their code or leak their code. But really, if you didn't trust this consultancy, why'd you hire them? Let's go back to our mistake 1. Gotta hire the right people. Hire people that you trust. Our fix, as harsh as it sounds, is to get our shit together. Make a checklist of steps that your team needs to go through before your testers arrive on day 1. Set those pen testers up for success. And by success, I mean give them anything that they need to find all of those janky security compromises that you made while you were making your app at breakneck speed. Provide them with ample documentation, maybe a Postman collection of your APIs so they can look at what your request and response flow looks like. Those are super helpful. Test accounts. You want engineers from your various dev teams to answer questions. You want them available. And then you want to support the testers as much as possible so that they'll be able to spend their time finding vulnerabilities, not fumbling around in the dark. I also would highly advise granting code access. There are certain categories of vulnerabilities that are pretty easy to spot in code, but really hard to find just by poking around. Like thinking of blind SQL injection, right? That's kind of an obvious code pattern to see. If you find it, you can usually grep for it or use a static analysis tool to find that type of vulnerability. But if you're poking and just looking for stuff around the app, you're probably not going to find blind SQLite. It's really hard to find. And then when you're granting test accounts to your testers, I can't stress this enough, they do need multiple accounts. So if you just give them one account, they're probably going to miss multiple attack surfaces on things like insecure direct object reference or privilege escalation. If your app has different types of users like admin users, regular users, and guest users, you want to give them at least one user at each level of privilege, preferably multiple. When it comes to Slack, account setup can take a really long time, especially with our enterprise offering, and especially if we want test workspaces to reflect what a customer's workspace would actually look like. So we started providing our pen testers with 2 different test enterprises with multiple different users at each level of privilege, and then different workspaces that belong to each org, as well as Slack Connect channels, so that it would look like what an actual customer's account might look like. Now, because we did this setup beforehand, the testers get to focus on what they came for, finding security bugs, not being Slack admins. Now also, for the love of all that is holy, make sure your product works before scheduling a pen test. And make sure that whatever the environment the testers will be using matches prod closely enough that it's going to be an accurate test. Like recently, I had a friend tell me that she was scheduled to do a pen test engagement, and it had to be rescheduled entirely because when she talked to the dev team about, her test environment, she said, "Hey, is this pretty close to what's in prod?" They were like, "No, totally different." Why would you do that? But I think the reason that they did that is they didn't know. They didn't know ahead of time. It was well-natured. They thought that she would do fine in this test environment, but the findings that she pulls out of that test environment are going to be completely irrelevant to what you're running in prod. That sucks. That's a waste of money. Okay, next mistake we made during our event planning. We actually forgot about our event, and we logged our servers out of it, and overall we were really unresponsive to their requests for help. So people who have been pen testers, have you ever showed up for day one of a gig and realized the company didn't do anything to prepare for your arrival, and actually they have no idea what you're there to do? Yeah? I see a couple hands. Yep, absolutely. True story, I've actually done pen test engagements with companies that forgot that I was coming more than once. AppSec teams, when you're scheduling a pen test, are you dedicating at least one human person with technical knowledge of your application to keep track of the progress of the engagement? Every moment that the testers spend twiddling their thumbs is very costly. And if you're making the testers wait for you to unblock them, each day wasted is thousands of dollars down the drain. So what's our fix here? We want to get organized and we want to communicate clearly. Think about questions like these. How often do you want to hear from your pen testers? How do you want them to communicate with you? Do you want emails? Do you want phone calls? Or do you want Slack channels? Yes, you do. Have you set up kickoff calls and readout calls and maybe just a few status calls in between to see how things are progressing? If you haven't, you might not realize that the entire engagement is on fire until the last day. When do you want them delivering findings to you, especially your high and critical risk findings? Pretty much high and critical risk, I'm assuming you want to know about those right away so you can address those before they get exploited. And a lot of pen test companies already know this. They'll deliver high and critical risk findings to you pretty quickly, but maybe they don't know this, and maybe they need you to tell them. Who on your team knows your code and your application well enough to provide meaningful assistance to the pen testers? And do you know what the pen testers are there to do? If not, you should really ask about what they do and what their methodology is before they get there, and ideally before you hire them. Also, have you alerted the engineers who are in charge of detecting threats in your application that they might notice some anomalous behavior? And they should really check in them with the pen testers before they trigger an incident over activity that resembles a live attack on your application. That can be a time waster too. All right, during our event planning scenario, we made one more grave mistake. We didn't have any plan for remediation or cleanup. So when you're hosting an event, you should always have a cleanup plan or people are going to be very upset with you for leaving such a big mess. All right, so now we've finished our pen test engagement. We've got a bunch of findings, AKA a big ol' mess. And now we need to figure out who's going to fix these findings. Your pen testers are long gone because your test ended 3 weeks ago. And now you're just deciding to assign bug tickets. Your devs are pissed because they had already planned out the work they intend to do for the next few sprints. But now you're telling them they have 3 days to fix a bug. Your devs are also pissed because they're reading through the findings and realizing these are 90% false positives. And you're also realizing no one really understands the remediation guidance that the testers provided in the report. And then you realize you have a pen test finding that has a fix recommendation that would actually break your app. That's not great. How do we fix this? You want to make sure that you can fix all of the things. Don't ruin your AppSec team's relationship with your developers. You want to give them an opportunity to be involved in this pen test at every stage of the process. And don't suffer in silence. If your pen test report has unclear remediation guidance or you just don't understand it, you've got to ask for more information on that during the readout. You can't just sit there and go, yeah, totally, I get it, and then 3 weeks later realize you don't get it. And give your engineering team the chance to come in and ask questions and do the same work that you're doing. You should know your application well enough that you can identify false positive findings and push back on findings that are not really relevant to you. Like, for example, if you get a finding that outlines access issues on an API that you fully intended to be public and unauthenticated, you should ask for that finding to be removed from the report, because you did that on purpose. Don't pass that finding along to your dev team. They'll get mad. You should also know your application well enough to know if a recommended fix would be detrimental to your app. Like if the report dings you for not requiring two-factor authentication, but you intentionally didn't require 2FA because you know your users and you know some of them are going to be pretty confused by that, then that finding should probably be informational at most. You need to know your org structure and your application well enough to know who owns which part of the code base and who's responsible for fixing different areas of the app. It sounds pretty simple, but actually everyone I've talked to about this problem experiences that same problem of ownership and figuring out, like, okay, cool. That thing over there that no one's touched in 6 years, who fixes that? Hard problem. Having a security champions program or a similar way of building relationships between your AppSec team and your developers can help everyone get a little bit of a better understanding of who does what in your org. Now, at Slack, we have a budding security champions program, and it's actually really helped our product security team find the right people to answer the hard questions more quickly. And also, if you don't already have SLAs for fixing your security issues, you want to take the time to make remediation timelines after your readout. It helps to prioritize your high-risk vulnerabilities first, and then address the lower-risk ones with slightly less urgency. And don't just let your security bugs rot in the corner where you think no one's going to find them. They're going to bite you in the ass when you least expect it. All right, so what did we learn today? We learned that poorly planned events yield crappy outcomes, and poorly planned pen tests yield very boring findings. So if you find yourself frequently on the receiving end of reports that are sparse and boring from pen test engagements, ask yourself, did I do a good job of planning this engagement? What mistakes did I make, and what could I have done differently? And always remember to be a good host. That's it for today. Does anyone have any questions? I think we do have a little time for Q&A. I see one. I think we're doing them at the mic if you wanted to come up, or I can probably hear you from here. We wound up making kind of an internal checklist of what made sense to us. I don't know if there's any like open source options out there for checking off those boxes yourself, but I think it can help to sit down with your team and figure out what are we trying to get done here, and then make that little checklist of make sure I involve the right developers, make sure I've provisioned the right accounts, and I've given everyone GitHub access. Just basic stuff like that that can fall by the wayside if you haven't written it down.
Hey, Robyn, thanks
Hello.
for the talk. So I do this type of stuff all day long. We've done like 3,000 pen tests. The biggest problem I find is that there's no industry kind of consensus on a lot of these things. You mentioned like, okay, hey, don't pick a bad vendor and just do the check the box. But people do that on purpose. And we've had things like the Pentest execution standard and things like this, but nothing's ever caught on. What do you think we can do to kind of change that?
Oh, that is such a good question. Ooh, hello. Yeah, that is such a good question. And it's not one that I don't think I have a good answer to that just yet. What can we do to make better standards for our pen test consultancies, you think? Is that the question?
Yeah, because there's an
Yeah.
asymmetry there. Because the pen testers aren't going to do it themselves, because then they're going to give information to their competitors.
Yeah.
And the clients just never seem to want to do it. All they do is complain about the pen testers.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that the answer there is to hold our consultancies to a higher standard. And, remember, if you've had a bad engagement, don't continue to hire the same people if they've given you poor results. Or, you can give them feedback and say, like, hey, this is what went wrong on this engagement. How can we improve that? Give them a chance to improve. Instead of just, complaining in a corner and then continuing to hire the same people while you're complaining in the corner. That doesn't make any sense. So,
Right on, thanks.
Stepped on that. My apologies. In your experience, what are some excellent inquiries or questions that have been asked of you in your time at NCC, in which you're like, oh yes, that indicate to you that this is a potentially positive experience that's going to happen? So, like, what questions does the pen testing team ask, or what questions would you like to be asked as a AppSec industry?
I think there are probably two sides to this. So from the pen test side of things, I always really liked it when a company would ask me, like, what my area of expertise is. Do you understand this framework or this language? And then also, like, they would ask me, how many test accounts do I need and what levels of access do I need? That was always really helpful because I knew from the jump, okay, you know what I'm here to do. This is great. Just basically asking me what my needs were as a tester helped me so much because I didn't have to decide myself, this is what I need from you, because I don't know your application if I'm coming in from outside. You know your application. You might know what I need better than I do. So asking me those questions and having those conversations are great. And I think from the AppSec side of things, I really like when testers ask me questions like, what keeps your team up at night? Because that way I know that they're going to be prioritizing the things that are giving me nightmares.
Hello. So how to find a good vendor, Pentest vendor? Is it sort of G2 reviews? Because I have experienced really huge vendors in this industry keeping a basic cross-site scripting issue. So, I mean, the name is not always a sign of quality.
Yeah. I think it's an exercise in diligence more than anything. So when we've been looking for vendors, we'll create a spreadsheet of crowdsourced opinions, and we'll ask people on the team, on the security team, like, hey, what vendors have you heard of? What vendors have you worked with? Which ones did you have good experiences with? Which ones did you have bad experiences with? And just kind of crowdsource opinions there. And then once you have a decent list of maybe 10 different places, you can go to their website and see if they have sample reports there, see if they have information about their pricing. Sometimes it might be a little bit hard to find that information, so that's when you start having calls. You might pick 2 or 3 of them to have phone calls with, and then ask them all the information that you need to figure out, does this budget work? Do I think that you're going to do a good job? Do I know your areas of expertise? That kind of thing.
So there is no such thing like Google reviews or G2 reviews or whatever.
Maybe we need to start a pen test consultancy like Yelp. But yeah, I haven't seen anything like that yet.
Yeah, unfortunately, because sometimes salespeople are much better than their pen testers, right?
Yeah, it's possible. Some of the better calls that I've had with pen test firms that are just for figuring out if it's going to work or not, they'll include the consultants, and then that way you can have that conversation with the consultants to figure out if they're going to do what you need them to do. Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Happy DEF CON.